Hello and thank you for joining us. I am David. I'm one of the pastors here at Restore Church. We are in our third week of our series called All Thrones. This is a look at the supremacy of Christ as seen in the book of Colossians. In October of 1979, while on a first date, a retired Florida park ranger named Jan Massey was in the Everglades National Park and was driving along one of the trails out there and came across an 11-foot 9-inch road-killed Burmese python. That's a first date you remember. I don't know if that leads to a second date or not. If you find an 11-foot 9-inch python on the road, and I assume the fact that we've got the story that they stopped and they examined it and measured it and made a phone call or something. This is in 1979, so this is before cell phones. You didn't just call somebody. You would have had to maybe pick it up and take it somewhere. But also it was road-killed, so somebody else actually found it, right? And apparently they didn't stop and examine it. They just didn't like snakes. So that was the first python, the first Burmese python that was captured and removed from the area there. Now that invasive snake species is breeding at an almost uncontrolled rate in South Florida. Now, Burmese pythons, they're called invasive because they're not native to South Florida. They come from Asia, and they don't have, in Florida, they don't have natural predators. So they are, in some ways, they are destroying the local ecology, and they are eating up a lot of the native animals like rabbits and fox and deer, even alligators. And these snakes can get big. We're like 18 feet long. Some of them in Asia, where they're native to, are over 20 feet long. And I don't mind a snake. I don't want a 20-foot snake, but snakes don't bother me. But ultimately, these species, these Burmese pythons and some of the other pythons, they are not native to Florida. And so they are an invasive species, and they are harming the local ecology. And so finally in 2012, the federal government banned the import of Burmese pythons along with some other large snakes that were threatening the local lands and areas. They are one of the largest snakes in the world. They can get over 20 feet long. They are able to unhinge. They have this crazy flexible jaw, and it allows them to eat and swallow very large prey. And they've been found to eat things that are almost as big as they are, which is crazy. And in rare documented cases, they have even preyed upon people. Crazy. The longest python ever captured in Florida is an 18-foot, 9-inch snake that was found in October of 2020. 18 feet, 9 inches. And it was captured by a couple of professional python hunters. Yes, that's a thing now. You can become a professional python hunter. I don't know if FSU has a course in python hunting or how you become a professional python hunter. But there's actually these programs down in South Florida where they're working to eliminate the massive numbers of these pythons, and these programs are run by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, and just trying to tame the invasive species there. In December of 2021, an almost 18-foot python was captured by researchers from the captured in Southwest Florida, and was billed as the largest python ever recorded outside of its native habitat. So this snake wasn't quite as long as the other one, but due to its weight, 215 pounds, it has been billed as the largest python ever recorded outside of its native habitat. And how these guys in December of 2021 captured it, this is crazy. They actually used a scout snake. So they had a captured male python, and they equipped it with a tracking device, and then they released it during breeding season to lead them to the big female. Because with pythons and some other animals, females are usually bigger, and so they were wanting to capture the biggest snake they could find, and so they released a male snake with a tracking device to go and help them capture a female snake. And when they did a necropsy on this female snake they captured, they discovered 122 developing eggs inside the python. So that gives you a little idea of how these snakes can breed and take over when they are an invasive species, and they're in a habitat where there's nothing hunting them. And so you're probably wondering, why am I giving you a little lesson on invasive species and pythons in Florida? Well, it's because sin is an invasive species. That's right. Sin it's an invasive species, and we're going to read from Colossians 3, and we're going to see that we weren't meant for this. God has intended something other than our sinful nature to be dominant in our life. Sin is an invasive species. So Colossians chapter 3, I'm going to read the whole chapter. We've done this every week in this series. We just read the entire chapter, and then we'll kind of go back through and highlight some different key ideas and thoughts from the chapter. So Colossians 3. Since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand. And right away we see, again, this theme of the supremacy of Christ. He is in heaven on the throne. So, think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth. For you died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, is revealed to the whole world, you will share in all his glory. So put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you. Have nothing to do with sexual immorality and impurity, lust, and evil desires. Don't be greedy, for a greedy person is an idolater, worshiping the things of this world. Because of these sins, the anger of God is coming. You used to do these things when your life was still a part of this world. But now is the time to get rid of anger, rage, malice, behavior, slander, and dirty language. Don't lie to each other, for you have stripped off your old sinful nature and all its wicked deeds. You see, the Apostle Paul, who is writing this, he is beginning to kind of unfold this idea that if you have accepted Christ's offer of forgiveness of sins, you have been united with Christ, and talks about how in baptism we it's symbolic of us of our death, the old nature dying, and we're raised up out of the water to new life with Christ, and we're now alive with Christ dwelling in us. And that once we've come to Christ, sin is now an invasive species. It doesn't belong in our life anymore. We are no longer sin's native habitat. It's an invasive species. Verse 10, put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator and become like Him. In this new life, it doesn't matter if you are a Jew or a Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbaric, uncivilized, slave or free. Christ is all that matters, and He lives in all of us. Since God chose you to be the holy people he loves, you must clothe yourself with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which bind us all together in perfect harmony. And let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body, you are called to live in peace and always be thankful. Let the message about Christ in all of its richness fill your lives. Teach and counsel each other with all the wisdom he gives. Sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God with thankful hearts. And whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting for those who belong to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. Children, always obey your parents, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not aggravate your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. Serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Work willingly at whatever you do as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and that the master you are serving is Christ. But if you do what is wrong, you will be paid back for the wrong you have done, for God has no favorites. And so in this chapter, Paul, he begins and he sets the tone that we are now with Christ. We are united with Christ, and our real life is hidden with Christ and God, as he says. And sin is this invasive species now. We have a new ecology. Our life is a new habitat, and sin no longer belongs in it. And so then he goes through and he kind of gives us this list of various types of sins and says we must get rid of these things because God has called us to be holy, and those things aren't holy. And then he says that it doesn't matter your background, where you came from, your lineage. All that matters is Christ, and he now lives in us. The God of the universe, who created everything, who is above everything, who is in control and holding all things together, he now lives in you. And I don't even know how to describe that adequately, but he lives in us. And so we must begin to clothe ourselves with the things of God. Paul is like, you put on the clothes of kindness and humility and gentleness and patience and mercy, so that we will begin to look more and more like Christ. And then he goes on and he says that we should let the message of Christ and all of its riches fill our lives. We're representatives of Christ. We must essentially look like it. And he's clothe ourselves. And he's not talking about like put on a new jacket or something. He's saying literally the things of your life, the patterns of behavior, your attitudes, your actions, all of that should begin to reflect and look like that of Christ. And then he closes the chapter out with just some practical instructions and what that looks like within a family. And then he talks about slaves and like servants, and it's important to make the distinction that the culture that Paul is writing to, slavery wasn't a thing it wasn't something done purely on race or along those lines. It was slavery in this culture was often a result of just an economy. It was the result of you having an unpaid debt, and so you would give yourself over. You become the servant or a slave of somebody to pay that debt, or sometimes somebody within your household would serve out that. And so slavery, as Paul is talking about it in Colossians, it's different than how we normally think of slavery in our Western or American mindset. And so if it sounds like Paul is being like a little nonchalant about it, it's because he's talking about a different form of it. So that's just a little note. You can read more about that if you like. But he's basically saying, like, you are indebted to that person, so serve them as if you're serving Christ. So, Colossians chapter 3. And the first thing that I want to say is that we talked about sin being an invasive species. Paul starts the chapter off, and he's really saying that the time of dead reckoning is over. Now, dead reckoning, you've maybe heard the term before. It is how sailors would navigate when, in simplified terms, how did they navigate when they couldn't see the stars? How did they navigate when it was too cloudy, when there was storms and they couldn't see the sky, they couldn't use their normal methods? And so dead reckoning is determination without the aid of celestial navigation of the position of a ship or aircraft from a record of courses sailed or flown. So if they know where they started from, they take measurements to know how much distance they're traveling. And if they know where they're going to, they're using dead reckoning as this calculation to determine where am I on the map if I know where I started and I know the distance to where I'm ending, and I can't use the stars as my guide. How do I navigate? And so dead reckoning was the way they did that. And Paul is saying the time of dead reckoning is over. And the reason he is saying that is he said, set your sights on the realities of heaven where Christ lives, or where Christ sits at the place of honor at God's right hand. Think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth. And so Paul is making this point that in your old life before Christ, you were living in an age and an era when you had to use dead reckoning. You did not have the Spirit. You did not have Christ to guide you. And so you didn't think about the things of heaven. You didn't let the realities of heaven be a guide for your life. But now, with Christ, stop living in an era of dead reckoning. You don't have to live that way anymore. Now you have Christ, you have the Spirit within you, and think of the things of heaven. Set your sights on the realities of heaven and let that mindset guide you. And then he goes on in the chapter and he discusses how we must rid ourselves of sin. That the nature and the power of sin has been crushed by the power of the cross. And we read that some in the prior chapter, which I didn't read today, but if you were to read in chapter 2, you'd see some of that. And so Paul is talking about how do we get rid of the old nature? How do we get rid of this sin that he says is lurking within you? So put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you. Paul is saying that we need to feed the parasite raw garlic. Now, he doesn't say that that's not a direct quote. Feed the parasite raw garlic. That's not a direct quote from Paul. But Paul is describing kind of a parasite within us, sin. It doesn't belong in us anymore, and we must get rid of it. And when I think of something that doesn't belong in my body that I must get rid of, my boy brain that sometimes is weird made me think of parasites. It's kind of gross, I know, but I'm just kind of weird like that. So how do you get rid of a parasite? Well, garlic has been widely used to treat intestinal parasites. There is this anti-hemolytic effect. I don't know if I'm saying that right way. The effect of garlic has been a matter of interest of researchers, and their results showed that treatment with garlic evoked a significant reduction in the worm load. So when we're talking about parasites, you need to lower the worm load. I don't know if you knew that or not, but you need to have a reduction in the worm load to rid yourself of parasites. And garlic is this thing that has been used for that. It has been used as both food and medicine in cultures for thousands of years, dating at least as far back as that time at the Giza pyramids were built. And there's actually, so ancient Egyptians, we've seen the use of garlic in some of their artwork, and it's described in the walls of the ancient temples, and so garlic was used way back when as a medicine, and actually it contains 17 amino acids and at least 33 compounds in it, and you can do your own research. There's a lot of things I can't pronounce, and there's a lot of medical stuff with it. If you like do a search on the medicinal uses of garlic, you will see that it has been used to rid your body of parasites. It's got a lot of antimicrobial properties, and there's been studies done where they use mice and they give the mice parasites, and then they feed half the mice garlic and half of them don't get it, and then they measure the amount of parasites in the mice, and so we've scientifically proven that garlic can help reduce the worm load. And so if you have parasites, and I'm not judging, I'm not suggesting you do, but if you have parasites, eat garlic, it will help. And so what Paul is saying is you must do something to rid yourself of this parasite of sin. And Paul lists all these different sins, and then he's saying that you must do something to rid yourself, but he's not saying just try hard to stop sinning. That's not his method. That's not what he's advocating. Just try really hard to stop sinning. No, he's instead saying that you must do something to replace the sin. See, Paul goes through this list of the things that you must rid yourself of, all these sins. And then he follows that up with a list of things to replace that. And so Paul is saying that we must learn to replace sin with the things of God, that we can't just stop thinking about sin. Instead, start thinking about the things of Christ. Start dwelling on the things of Christ. Start replacing these habits with this new attitude, this new way of thinking, this new way of living. You must rid yourselves of the sin. There's no way around that. And so Paul gives us a method. You don't just stop, you have to replace. It's sort of how, like, when you need to reduce the worm load, you've got to do something that will rid yourself of that. Eat garlic. Dwell on the Word of God. Begin to think about the things of Christ. Clothe yourself with these things. Rid yourself of this and put on this. So you're chosen for holiness. I don't know if you know that. You were chosen for holiness. You aren't chosen just to barely make it by. You're not chosen to come to Christ and stop this habit, but just still struggle with this the rest of your life. You weren't chosen to just live with the parasite of sin. You weren't chosen to just always have this invasive species just haunting you. No. You were chosen for holiness. You were chosen to become like Christ. How does that happen? How do we rid ourselves of the old and become new? Let the message about Christ in all its richness fill your lives. See, if we were chosen for holiness, that must mean it's possible. That must mean that there must be some way in which we can become holy. How does it happen? I think verse 16 is a big clue. Let the message about Christ and all of its richness fill your lives. See, for us to become holy, I think we've got to make room for that. How much room does your life have? How much empty time and space? For a lot of us, we would say, there's not much margin in my life. And that would be normal. But we're not called to normal. The thing that Paul is saying we are called to is not just normal. We were chosen for more than normal. We are chosen for holiness. And I think for us to become that, we've got to have some space in our life. It's time to make room for the glory of Jesus. I think one of the downfalls of modern culture, of the way we do life right now, is we have filled up our life with a lot of things. How many evenings a week do you have a couple of quiet hours to reflect on the words and the work of Christ in your life? Any? How often do you and your whole family just spend an hour around the dinner table discussing Colossians chapter 3 or some other section in the Bible? When Paul says that we should let the message about Christ in all its richness fill your lives, that word fill it's troubling, right? Because for most of us, we don't have enough empty space for something else to fill. And here's Paul telling us, look, you were called to be holy. You were called to look like Jesus. You are an ambassador of him. And you need to let his message and the richness of it fill your life. And here we are saying, You mean fill in this little space over here, or this little crack of time I have here, or I've got a 3 to 3:30 appointment next Wednesday. It can fill that time slot. See, I think Paul, when he was inspired by the Spirit to write that, he both understood the realities of life, right? That we work. There's things that are kind of the norm. Like you have to take care of your body. You have to take care of your children, and there are relationships. And Paul understood all of that, but he still said that the message about Christ and its richness should fill our lives, to teach and counsel each other with all the wisdom he gives. Sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God with thankful hearts. And whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. And that sounds like it's going to take a little more time than what we've often given it. So what does Paul want us to do? Would he honestly have the gall to instruct us to rearrange the order and the priorities of our life to make Christ center, instead of giving Christ what's left? See, this is a hard message. This is hard because Paul is telling us, he's established for us the supremacy of Christ. The glory is beyond anything else. And then he's told us that glory, we're going to share in it. And that Christ lives in us. And so we must rid ourselves of the old and put on the new. And that part of that is understanding that we've been chosen to become holy. And that holiness requires us to have this oneness of mind, where we make Christ central. And Paul is basically saying, you may have to turn your life upside down. You may have to rearrange all of your priorities. But whatever it takes, make Christ central in your life. It's time to make room for the glory of Jesus. And he goes on and he uses this analogy of clothing, of what you take off and what you put on. And I don't do this myself much. My wife, she will try on an outfit and then decide she doesn't like it, and so then she'll put on a different outfit because she wants to look her best. And that particular day, it's a good day for this color. I don't know how you make all those determinations, but she's like, this is the outfit for today. She wants to, and her job requires her to dress professionally, and she wants to look her best. And Paul is telling us the same. He is telling us to dress for heaven. Put on the things of Christ. Clothe yourself with these things, because you are chosen for holiness. It's time to make room for the glory of Christ. It's time to rid yourself of that invasive species. It's time to get rid of the parasite of sin and begin to fill your life with the richness and the glory of Jesus. And so do whatever it takes. Rearrange your priorities. Do whatever it takes to make Christ central in your life, so that you're dressed for heaven. When I read Colossians chapter 3, there's a handful of statements that just stand out to me. You've been raised to new life with Christ. For you died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. Christ is all that matters, and he lives in all of us. God chose you to be the holy people he loves. So put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you. Let the message about Christ and all of its richness fill your lives. Put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator and become like him. Jesus is God. He is before all things, greater than all things, and holds all things together. And he is at work in you. He is empowering you and encouraging you and helping you to rid yourself of the old and dress yourself with the new. Jesus, who is supreme, is at work in you.